Do you wake up in the morning and just feel things aren't quite right? Well, I wake up every morning and I know things aren't quite right. Now, we have 25 million people living on a resource-rich continent, and we have problems that you wouldn't expect in a rich country. Like 30% of the population relying on social security benefits to survive. Homelessness, difficulty accessing accommodation, long public health waiting lists, huge issues regarding access to education, and the list goes on and on and on. And then you think to yourself, this is Australia. This is not Bangladesh. This is not 120 million people living on a floodplain. This is Australia. This is not 1 million people living in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. This is Australia. So why do we find ourselves in this situation? Now, what happens in the world regarding mineral resources is quite interesting. Different sovereign states have different mechanisms via which they benefit from the mineral resources underground. Now, in this country, everything that's underground, irrespective of whether you hold freehold title or not, belongs to the Crown. And what we have done in this country over the last century, well, last 120 years since Federation, is we have basically given away this country's mineral wealth, the First Nations people's wealth and our wealth, to corporations and businesses for a peppercorn rent, hoping that through levying royalties in some states and through the taxation system, that somehow we as a country will benefit from our resources. So why should we allow private companies, which are based on the concept of private investment for private profit, dominate the resource sector? Why should we allow the creation of billionaires? You know, every year when you look at the billionaires rich list, it's always people who own resources, because ultimately, theoretically, they belong to this country's First Nations people and they belong to us, residents and citizens of this country. It is our wealth. It is the Commonwealth. It's the Commonwealth of Australia. If we can't own and develop what is under our very feet, what can we own and develop? So we have a large problem. Now, currently the mining industry is quite conscious of the fact that people are getting a little bit annoyed about the fact that most of the profits are going in their pockets and very little is coming in royalties and taxation revenue. Although it seems a lot when you look at it, but when you look at the division between what they get and what we get, the Australian public gets, it's very little. Minimal. So here we are in the midst of a resources boom, but not profiting from what's actually occurring. And then we've got all the other issues involving COVID-19, then the other issues revolving mechanisation, increased unemployment, and the list goes on and on. So what should we do? Well, there's a number of ways. Different countries around the globe deal with it in different ways. In Nigeria, 50% of profits go directly to the government. Unfortunately, Nigeria is an exceptionally corrupt country, and most of that money does not filter down to the population. Now, we as a country obviously don't have the corruption levels that they have in Nigeria. In Norway, over 90% of all profits go into a common wealth fund, which is used for the future benefits of the Norwegian people. But in this country, the situation is so ridiculous that we can't even acquire gas at a reasonable price, although we're the second biggest exporter of gas on the planet. It's just extraordinary. And then we've got the situation of people like billionaires strutting their stuff, setting up their own philanthropic trusts and charities and looking after their own special interests. It's just extraordinary. So what I'm going to propose is a little bit radical. I'm sorry to use the R word, RADICAL, why shouldn't the resources under our feet, which is the Commonwealth of this nation's First Nations people and our Commonwealth, why shouldn't we own those resources, develop those resources, profit from those resources, and use those resources for the benefit of the people? Now, I'm not talking about nationalisation. Unfortunately, we've seen nationalisation means that resources are owned by the government of the day. And as we saw with electricity, as we saw with water, as we've seen with the banking sector, financial sector, telecommunications, we've seen ports, airports, we've seen all these public assets privatised by governments of the day to solve a short-term budgetary deficit. What I'm talking about is using this country's constitutional mechanisms in order to reclaim our Commonwealth and use that Commonwealth for the common good. Because what's the point of having a specific sovereign nation state if you can't use your Commonwealth for the good of the people in this country, both First Nations people and the rest of us? So how do you do this? It's very simple. In this country we have a constitutional mechanism where the people can actually change the law through a referendum. Unfortunately, referendums are structured in such a way that it is only the government of the day, which is a majority in both houses of parliament, which has the power to actually call a referendum. And I'm suggesting that we increase political pressure on the different political parties to incorporate into their policy framework a policy of holding a referendum to nationalise this country's resources, to incorporate the ownership of this country's nationalised resources into the Australian Constitution and put that to the Australian people in a referendum. And if a majority of people in a majority of states agree to that proposal, what that means is that the resources then become the property of the Australian people, not the property of private corporations, and you would not have to buy back those resources. You would take them back because they are our resources. Obviously, there would be a hue and cry from the mining sector, the mass media, the government gilded ABC, certain political groups would be up in arms saying this is unfair. But what is more unfair than them utilising our resources to enrich themselves at our expense? So we need to think outside the box. I'm not talking about revolution, blood in the streets. I'm talking about simple constitutional challenge through a referendum. Hold a referendum. And I'm quite confident the Australian people as a whole will be very keen to use their resources, what is under our feet, our Commonwealth, for the common good. Now, if we nationalise, that's the Australian mining sector, and I'm talking about diamonds, gold, bauxite, rare minerals, coal, iron ore, uranium, and the list goes on and on. Not only can we actually benefit from that wealth, not only can First Nations people benefit from that wealth, but we can introduce policies which could restrain sections of the mining sector that create increased greenhouse emissions, like the fossil fuel industry, and at the same time compensate the workers in those industries who lose their jobs, who are fighting tooth and nail to retain their jobs. And if they knew that they would be looked after, then you wouldn't have this them and us situation where we'd all be working towards the common good. So these are ideas that they're not new, but what I'm doing is I'm bringing together a few things within our own constitutional framework. One, the resources is our common wealth. Governments have given away that common wealth to private corporations to develop, and they hope that through the taxation system and through royalties they get enough back to provide basic services. What I'm saying is it's time we took that back not through violent confrontation, but by forcing a government of the day to hold a referendum to put the question to the Australian people about nationalising this country's mineral wealth and use that wealth for our own benefit. For example, it could be used to create public housing for everybody who can't afford to enter the private housing market. It can be used to create a free education system, a tertiary free education system, to give everybody the opportunity to actually become part of the lucky country and become part of a economy which is based on quality, not quantity. We could use it to provide universal basic health care. We could use it to provide a universal basic income for all Australians, so that in times of crisis we don't have the situation we find ourselves in during the COVID-19 crisis, where some people are suffering and others aren't. And the list goes on and on. We can do many things if we nationalised this country's mineral resources, but the key is, this time, let's not leave it in the hands of the government. Let's not them own those resources. We've seen what they did with telecommunications. We saw what they did with water. We saw what they've done for electricity and gas. We've seen what they've done with the nation's ports. We've seen what they've done with everything that can be sold has been sold off. We have seen that week after week, year after year, decade after decade, because public property in this country does not belong to the people. It belongs to the government of the day, whether it's the state government or federal government. The only way to ensure that our mineral resources belong to the people and are used for the benefit of the people is totally dependent on their ownership being incorporated in the Australian Constitution. If it's incorporated in the Australian Constitution, that means the government of the day would have to go back to the people in another referendum to sell that asset on behalf of the people. This is the great weakness of Australian society. We have believed for far too long that public assets belong to the public. Public assets do not belong to the public. They belong to the government of the day. Let's use the wealth beneath our feet, our commonwealth, for our good. Let's nationalise this country's mineral resources. Let's incorporate that nationalisation in the Australian Constitution through a referendum. We could be the most prosperous people on the planet. We could compensate our First Nations people and make reparations for what has occurred. We could provide universal health care, universal education, universal housing. We could do so many things in this country. We could provide a universal basic income if we were masters of our own destiny and owned, developed and profited, like many countries do around the world, from our resources.